Forest fires are really dramatic and disruptive, but did you know that they play an important role in the carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen nutrient cycles? Hi there. Today we're going to talk about the recycling of matter in an ecosystem. So, if you remember from a few lessons ago, an open system involves the exchange of what two things in an ecosystem? That would be energy and matter. Well, we've already looked at the exchange of matter when we went through food chains and food webs, the exchange of energy. So now we're going to talk about the exchange and flow of matter in ecosystems. So energy flows into an ecosystem from the sun and escapes the ecosystem in the forms of heat. The survival of an ecosystem depends on the continual input of new energy from the sun. So when we have ecosystems in areas that they have very low light input, so like if we look at the Arctic in the winter, it's a very slow moving ecosystem because there's not much energy being put into it, versus the abundance of plants and animals that live in the Arctic during the summer when the sun's energy is 24 hours a day. Now, for matter, taking the form of elements and compounds, this will also move through the trophic levels of an ecosystem. However, it can move in either direction. It can move upwards through an ecosystem or downwards through an ecosystem. And so matter is going to be recycled. It doesn't ever escape the ecosystem. So there are four types of matter that are cycled in important ways through the ecosystem: water, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. Two types of cycles occur: the water cycle, which is the movement of water through an ecosystem, and it is going to be the most influential non living component of an ecosystem. So, again, we have very dry ecosystems like deserts compared to very moist and wet ecosystems like the jungle. So, we call these different cycles biogeochemical cycles because they move through the geological landscape as well as through the biological ecosystem. And again, if we look at biogeochemical, so like it does move through the geological components of the landscape. We could also look at the earth. So geo meaning earth or geographical. And then chemical, which is the elements and the compounds. So like I said, there's three elements that we're going to look at besides water: carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. So the hydrologic cycle, or the water cycle, is a natural and man-made process that recycles water through the ecosystem. So the sun's energy can cause water to evaporate from oceans, lakes, and transpire from plants. This adds water vapor to the atmosphere, which then is going to increase the humidity of an area. When the water vapor enters the atmosphere and it rises, it can cool and condense, which forms clouds or fog. Afterwards, it falls as precipitation: rain, sleet, snow, or hail. At that point, water can be absorbed by the ground to be taken up by the roots of plants, or it can run off and forms lakes or streams. And plants use the water available to them for photosynthesis. So looking at the water cycle here, we have water going into the atmosphere from evaporation and transpiration from plants, where it condenses before it falls as precipitation. It can be surface runoff, trickle through down to groundwater, be absorbed by plants, or then become surface water in lakes, streams, ponds, or the ocean. The water can be added to the atmosphere through the processes of evaporation, cellular respiration, and transpiration, and removed from the atmosphere from condensation and precipitation and photosynthesis. So there are both natural and man-made events that have significant impacts on the water cycle. One of them is wildfires. So as the organic matter burns, water vapor is produced. But when a forest burns, it's also no longer able to absorb and hold on to that water. So we end up with more surface runoff and incidentally more contaminants in that runoff and into the surface water, which will then run eventually to the ocean. So the total amount of water in that ecosystem is going to be reduced, which will prevent regrowth for about 2 years. And this regrowth, not only it can be forms of grasses, but we're more typically talking about shrubs and larger plants. Humans impact the water cycle through removing fresh water from the environment for agriculture, industrial, or urban uses, and returning polluted water, whether with chemicals or heat. So this lower water quality is less able to support aquatic ecosystems. Also through the process of deforestation, which has a similar impact to wildfires, because there's no longer vegetation to hold on to that water that falls through precipitation. Less water is held in the ecosystem, it's less able to regulate its temperature and moisture content. It can also lead to poorer conditioned surface water because there's more contaminants in the runoff. Next, we're going to talk about the carbon cycle. And all life on Earth has carbon as its building block. It's the basis for proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. It's important to have carbon dioxide in our atmosphere because plants need it for photosynthesis. All living organisms return carbon dioxide to the atmosphere by cellular respiration, including plants. Um, and carbon is stored in various reservoirs. It can be things like animal fuel, fossil fuels, animal fossils, calcium carbonate in the ocean, and carbon in long living life forms such as trees. A carbon sink is a system that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so for photosynthesis, and it can be stored in things like plants. A carbon source is a system that adds carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, so like the combustion of fossil fuels or cellular respiration. Sun allows the plants to pull carbon dioxide into out of the atmosphere for photosynthesis, and plants will use that carbon from carbon dioxide to form glucose molecules. Then plants and animals will burn those glucose molecules, will break them apart during cellular respiration, which returns that carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So that allows the carbon dioxide to cycle. Plants will take it in for photosynthesis, and plants and animals will return it back to the atmosphere during cellular respiration. When living things die, some of the carbon stored by their bodies is released by decomposers, and some may be trapped in fossils, depending really on what happens to that organism after it dies. So humans impact the carbon cycle in a major way by burning fossil fuels. So this is the combustion of coal, oil, and gas. And this reverses millions of years of carbon that had been stored by photosynthesis from when mostly swamp plants and algae turned into carbon and nitrogen sources under the ocean. That carbon was then trapped under layers of sediment and rock and has been trapped there for millions of years. So this is a long-term carbon sink. So, because of this, and it's not quick cycling carbon, it tends to increase the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Because this carbon was previously trapped in the earth as the form of fossil fuels, it wasn't part of the previously existing carbon cycle of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Now, that increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide is a cause of global warming and has resulted in climate change. Deforestation is another human impact that affects the carbon cycle because it reduces the trees that could be absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. And again, because these trees are often long lived, it's been a source of carbon that had been trapped in the atmosphere for a long period, or a source of earthbound carbon that was not being released back to the atmosphere. Now, the oxygen cycle kind of coincides with the carbon dioxide cycle because it is produced during photosynthesis and absorbed during cellular respiration. So, while the carbon cycle produces oxygen during cellular respiration, the oxygen cycle is used up during cellular respiration. So, these are complementary processes. So, the photosynthesis takes in carbon dioxide and produces oxygen, where cellular respiration takes in oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. So we'll often see a diagram of the oxygen and carbon cycle together because they both occur or they're both consumed or produced in the same processes of combustion, cellular respiration, and photosynthesis. So humans impact the oxygen cycle in a few different ways. One is wildfires, which take in oxygen as it burns, and it also removes that oxygen producing vegetation. Another one is the impact that humans have had on the ozone layer. So the ozone layer is about 10 kilometers above the Earth's surface, and it typically will absorb ultraviolet radiation so that that harmful radiation doesn't reach the surface of the Earth. Now, decades ago, a chemical called chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, was produced, and this was used as an aerosol in spray cans as well as a coolant chemical. Now, when these pollutants were released into the atmosphere, they reacted with the oxygen in the ozone layer. So the ozone was O3 particles, and it broke apart in the presence of ultraviolet radiation and chlorofluorocarbons. Now, this made the ozone layer thinner and less able to filter the sun's radiation. Now, since CFCs were banned, the ozone layer slowly started to repair itself, and the ozone holes have been getting smaller. The last biogeochemical cycle we're going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. And nitrogen is a critical element in biological structures because it forms the basis for both protein as well as DNA. The atmosphere is primarily 78% nitrogen, and then it would be 21% oxygen and 0.03% carbon dioxide, and the remainder would be inert chemicals. So when we look at atmospheric nitrogen, or N2, the bond between the two nitrogens is a triple bond, which makes nitrogen very stable and hard to break apart. So plants are unable to get usable nitrogen from the atmosphere because it takes too much energy to break their bonds. So plants rely on bacteria to convert that nitrogen gas into forms they can use, such as ammonia, NH3, or nitrate and nitrite ions in the soil. So there are two different ways that we can convert nitrogen. One is nitrogen fixation. So this is the process of bacteria converting nitrogen gas into ammonia, and nitrification, which is the converting of ammonia into nitrate and nitrite ions that are usable for the plants. And these are done by nitrifying bacteria. But because nitrogen is a cycle, nitrogen has to be able to return to its starting point, or N2 gas. So this requires a third type of bacteria, denitrifying bacteria, which converts excess nitrates back into atmospheric gas. Another really cool input of nitrates is lightning. So lightning is able to convert nitrogen gas into nitrates. So a lawn will often be noticeably greener after a lightning storm. So between the lightning and the rain, I'm assuming you're getting. So the electricity from the lightning floods the lawn with a new supply of nitrates. So some natural impacts on the nitrogen cycle are wildfires, which break down those complex nitrogen compounds into smaller compounds like nitrates and ammonia. So a wildfire has the same effect as nitrogen fixation. The heat from the fire as it warms the soil makes it more livable for nitrogen fixing bacteria. And then plants that thrive in soils with high nitrogen content are the first to grow back after a wildfire. So it changes the environment and the biotic factors, allowing for different plants to grow more readily. Humans can impact the nitrogen cycle by increasing the amount of fertilizers that are used, because one of the main ingredients in fertilizers is nitrogen. However, over reliance on fertilizers can pollute water sources by runoff, and then this is essentially then going to fertilize that water source, promoting and encouraging algae blooms, which can affect the water quality. Also, some emissions from smokestacks and car exhaust also produce nitrogen compounds, which can contribute to ground level smog pollution. So, talking about wildfires in general, the effects of wildfires on these cycles. In the water cycle, water vapor is produced, but the burning of trees means less retention of water in the soil. Wildfires, because they are combustion, produce carbon dioxide, and it removes plants that complete photosynthesis. They affect the oxygen cycle because combustion uses up oxygen, and again, they remove plants that do photosynthesis, so it's a loss of an oxygen source. And then for the nitrogen cycle, forest fires can create a dramatic increase of the nitrogen in the soil, as well as the soil is now more viable for nitrogen fixing bacteria, allowing the nitrogen in the soil to remain high. Thanks for staying with me for the biogeochemical cycles. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson.